I'd like to welcome you here this evening to the Melbourne Town Hall for the fourth debate in this season of Intelligence Squared Australia Debates. Tonight we are gathered here on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and on behalf of everybody here on the stage, I'd like to acknowledge them and to express our respect to their elders, the traditional owners of this place. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre, and I have the pleasure of chairing tonight's debate. The form for tonight's debate is outlined on the order paper. As to the topic, a carbon tax won't fix climate change. This is a debate that's been one of the most complex and difficult ones that we've had to put together since we started the series 4 years ago. The planning has taken 4 months, a great deal of negotiations and several times landing us in an imbroglio as large as Texas, just getting the right people together. The climate change debate in Australia is probably one of the most divisive issues that we have encountered, and at times the facts have been overshadowed by personalities, but not tonight. Big personalities, but they're not going to overshadow the debate. Tonight the debate about the carbon tax will be introducing a conversation, really, that we hope that you'll find passionate, edifying, civil and entertaining, as is always the aim of these debates. Now, I'm about to introduce 5/6 of the debating panel. You'll notice that there's one vacant chair at the moment. I'll explain that. Adam Bandt is coming down from Canberra. The House of Representatives rose this afternoon, and there's a bit of congestion at the airport, so he's going to be using up lots of carbon to get here on time. So I'll introduce him in his absence. Hopefully he'll get here, and since he's the third speaker for the negative, there's lots of discussion before he's due to speak. If for some reason he's not, then we'll sort of embroider this as we go through and ask Tim and Fiona to add a few extra remarks. I'm going to introduce all of the speakers as a group for the affirmative, all of the speakers for the negative, and I'd ask you to welcome them as a group after I've introduced them. So the first speaker for the affirmative is Stuart Allinson, co-founder and director of Exigency, an independent specialist energy and carbon market advisory firm. He has a broad-based energy and utilities background ranging from oil and gas exploration and production to incentive-based economic regulation, primarily in European markets. Stuart is a member of the Coalition Advisory Council on Climate Policy, along with Exigency's other founding director, Mr Adrian Palmer, who's also here in the audience. Stuart was educated at London University, Manchester University and the Kellogg Graduate School of Management, and holds degrees in mathematics, petroleum engineering and business administration. He's joined by Matthew Wright, who's the lead author of the award-winning Zero Carbon Australia Plan and is 2010's Young Environmentalist of the Year. As founder and executive director of the not-for-profit organisation Beyond Zero Emissions, Matthew heads the fastest growing climate change research and development group in Australia. While previous environmental advocates have encouraged Australians to take action by changing their light globes, Matthew represents the next wave of leaders who show how we can change from the 19th century technology that runs our economy at present to 21st century solutions. His attitude is reflected in Beyond Zero Emissions and fully shared by its workforce, staffed by over 100 volunteers. Finally, the third speaker for the affirmative is Professor Sinclair Davidson, a professor in the School of Economics, Finance and Marketing at RMIT University and a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He's written extensively on taxation policy in Australia and is a regular contributor to public debate. His opinion pieces have been published in The Age, The Australian Financial Review, The Drum, part of ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Wall Street Journal Asia. Sinclair has also published in academic journals such as the European Journal of Political Economy, Review of Political Economy, the Journal of Economic Behaviour and Organisation and the Cato Journal. Would you please welcome all of the speakers for the affirmative. Leading the case for the negative is Fiona O'Hehir, CEO of Greenbank Environmental, the largest independent trader of renewable energy certificates in Australia. Fiona has a technical background in electronics and power conversion for the solar industry and has been involved in the clean energy space for many years. She spent 6 years as an elected industry representative on the board of the Clean Energy Council. She's just completed a 2-year board position on Renewables SA. With a budget of $20 million, this government organisation was able to fund initiatives and to bring renewable infrastructure and employment to South Australia. In 2003, she started her own business to educate the solar industry about renewable energy targets and the need to create their solar credits for the remote area power and grid-connected installations. 8 years on, Greenbank Environmental is now the largest independent trader of renewable energy certificates and other environmental credits in Australia, with the creation of 4 million RECs and a turnover of $150 million last year. She's joined as the second speaker by a man I really think you can say honestly needs no introduction, Professor Tim Flannery, one of Australia's leading thinkers and writers, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer and conservationist. He's published more than 130 peer-reviewed scientific papers. His books include the landmark works The Future Eaters and The Weather Makers. This book has been translated into more than 20 languages and in 2006 won the New South Wales Premier's Literary Prize for Best Critical Writing and the Book of the Year. He received a Centenary of Federation Medal for his services to Australian science and in 2002 delivered the Australia Day Address. In 2005 he was named Australian Humanist of the Year. In 2007 honoured as Australian of the Year. He spent a year teaching at Harvard and is a founding member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists, a director of the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, and is on the international board of the WWF, the World Wildlife Foundation. In 2007, Tim Flannery co-founded and was appointed chair of the Copenhagen Climate Council, a coalition of community, business and political leaders who came together to confront climate change. And as you would all know, in 2011 he was appointed Australia's Chief Climate Commissioner. And in his absence, I'll introduce the Honourable Adam Bandt MP. He's a Greens MP, the federal member for Melbourne. He was elected in 2010 when he made history by becoming the first Greens MP elected to the House of Reps at a general election. Adams is the Industrial Relations and Banking spokesperson for the Greens, a participant in the government's multi-party committee on climate change. Since being elected, he's been busy. He's successfully moved motions on marriage equality. He's condemned the government's refugee deal with Malaysia. He's introduced legislation on protecting the Alpine National Park, banking reform, banning live animal exports, and gained parliamentary approval for argued for parliamentary approval for sending troops overseas and compensating firefighters with cancer. His background: he received an undergraduate law and arts degree with honours at Murdoch University, where he won the Sir Ronald Wilson Prize for Academic Achievement, and completed a PhD here at Monash University in 2008. He's written articles for many publications and has taught industrial relations law at RMIT. Would you welcome, including in his absence, all of the speakers for the negative? Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that a carbon tax won't fix climate change. I invite Stuart Allinson to address this House with his arguments for the affirmative. Stuart.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Wheeler Centre et al. Thank you, audience, for your attention. Thank you, fellow debaters, in advance of an interesting debate. I also wish to acknowledge my co-director at Exigency, Mr. Adrian Palmer, with whom the contest of ideas over 10 years is largely responsible for my addressing you tonight. To mangle a phrase from a previous Prime Minister, this is the carbon debate we had to have. I will open the debate for the affirmative team. We'll provide a range of arguments in support of the proposition that the carbon tax will not fix climate change. And our frame of reference, of course, as determined by the proposition, is Australia's proposed carbon tax, being the carbon pricing mechanism established through the Clean Energy Bill 2011, with a fixed price from 2012 and a floating price from 2015. I will argue that the carbon tax is an inefficient and inconsequential policy in climate terms. Australia, as in so many fields, can excel in the area of climate policy, but to do so, every dollar spent must be finely targeted, Every policy must be coordinated, and the whole economy, from industry to the voluntary sector, must be pulling in the same direction. To that extent, the carbon tax is seriously flawed. Whilst you contemplate the arguments tonight, I ask you to consider this. Would you pay polluters to reduce their emissions? In order to deconstruct the architecture and impacts of the carbon tax, it is necessary to remind ourselves of three things. The first is the concept of additionality. It tests whether an outcome would have happened in any event, and it's a key measure of policy effectiveness. The second is the abatement credit. This represents a reduction in man-made greenhouse emissions and is the currency of incentive schemes. These first two items are neatly illustrated in the case of compact fluorescent light bulbs. They were encouraged under the state-based New South Wales Greenhouse Gas Abatement Scheme, or GGAS, by placing an incentive of up to $15 per tonne on the emissions saved by changing from incandescent lighting. The phase-out of incandescent bulbs was subsequently announced by the Federal Minister, thereby achieving the environmental outcome through regulation and reducing the additionality under GGAS to zero. Now, it's always struck me that the Coalition's 2007 campaign slogan should have been, "How many environment ministers does it take to change a light bulb?" It also illustrates the importance of coordination at state and federal levels. Of course, the carbon tax does nothing to rationalise the 237 climate policies identified by the Productivity Commission in its stocktake for the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee. The third element is the emissions permit. This confers the right to release greenhouse gases to atmosphere and is the coin of penalty schemes like the carbon tax. Penalty schemes are beloved of classical economists. They impose a cost to reflect the environmental externality and limit the supply of permits in order to cause reductions in pollution. The prime example, and the poster child for the carbon tax, is the European ETS. Of course, the inconvenient truth for the classical economists is that this economically pure penalty scheme only works because it is propped up from offshore credits through the Clean Development Mechanism, or CDM, which is an incentive scheme. In reality, the ETS is a problem child. Europe emits around 2 billion tonnes of emissions per year, of which the ETS covers 40%. In the 5-year period ending in 2012, the Sandbag report estimates that the ETS will have saved a grand total of 30 million tonnes, 0.3% of Europe's emissions over that period, mainly because too many free permits were issued. In atmospheric terms, the ETS is monstered by the Clean Development Mechanism. By June 2010, the CDM incentive scheme had produced 620 million tonnes of internationally traded abatement credits, more than 30% of Europe's annual output of greenhouse gases, with a further 2.7 billion tonnes of credits in the pipeline. The other international example of an incentive scheme is the Chicago Climate Exchange. Whilst it is currently much reduced in scope due to the loss of US federal appetite for climate policy, it too has had greater atmospheric impact than the European scheme, according to its claimed 700 million tonnes of greenhouse gas savings in 7 years of operation. It is quite striking to me, and somewhat regrettable, that the Productivity Commission was not tasked with assessing the world's 2 largest carbon markets in its report to the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee, which recommended a tax. That's not to say that incentive schemes are without problems. Stanford University researchers Warra and Victor assessed that up to half of the abatement credits produced through the CDM may be spurious. That is, the savings were fraudulent, did not exist, or were going to occur anyway. This should be of concern to anyone who cares about environmental outcomes. Whilst it is intended to isolate the carbon tax from the worst CDM offenders, namely credits from removal of industrial gases such as HFCs, the problem of regulation of international credits remains. It's often stated that at around 550 million tonnes of emissions per year, Australia is responsible for 1.5% of the global total. I refute this. In 2009, Australia exported a further 800 million tonnes of emissions due to our exports of coal and liquefied natural gas. By 2016, we will export twice as many emissions as we emit on Australian soil, and that is before Queensland coal seam gas exports really begin to take off. However, in this case, we are only the supplier, and these emissions exports are not covered by the tax, nor, incidentally, are imported emissions. The carbon tax is forecast by Treasury to save 150 million tonnes per year by 2020, or less than half of 1% of global emissions. Only 50 million tonnes will actually be removed from our national inventory. The other 100 million tonnes of reductions will be acquired offshore through the CDM. I've not seen the Treasury assumptions, but in light of the additionality risk, I would hope that a discount factor has been applied to the number of credits to model the real environmental outcomes and not merely the fulfilment of a legal obligation. In summary, the carbon tax is inefficient because it will have to operate alongside 237 retained climate policies, and it carries the risk of buying CDM credits for no environmental gain. The carbon tax is inconsequential because it will contribute less than half of 1% of global emissions reductions and affect overall atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases by less than 1/20,000th. In any event, it will be outstripped by a factor of more than 3 to 1 in the growth of our own LNG and coal exports. Consequently, the carbon tax will not fix climate change. Thank you.
Good evening. Obviously, I have to disagree with Stuart. Putting a price on pollution is a start towards fixing climate change. I said pollution, that was deliberate. The conversation in Australia has been focused on the single word, carbon, as if it's a new phenomena, and it's not. It's not new. We have witnessed events that have caused terrible and long-lasting pollution of the landscapes. The Octedi, Montara, Deepwater Horizon. We can see landscape pollution, whilst the saturation of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere is less obvious. We all recognise pollution over the skyline, but it is much bigger and deeper than that. The only way to calculate greenhouse gas is to measure other things, namely energy consumption across all fuel types and actual emissions where possible. This pollution is an externality. Polluters currently emit for free, smearing their carbon costs across all Australians. A carbon tax will even out this cost smearing, but it will require social and institutional change and community support, which I believe we have. Because the road to climate stabilisation is so very long, we need unfaltering bipartisan commitment to deal with this dilemma sensibly. The current debate is hampered by our adversarial political system and the 24-hour media cycle that drives a line of fear, failure and scarcity across all sectors of industry and the community. From a personal point of view, I was very proud to be at the climate change negotiations in Copenhagen. These negotiations were not a failure as portrayed in the media, both internationally and here at home. These reports that there were protesters, barricades and unrest on a large scale are simply not true. There was the odd activist, there was no mass unrest, and the barricades, well, that was a row of bicycles. And what would you expect in Denmark? What I can tell you is Copenhagen actually delivered a huge commitment where 95 nations, more than 95 actually, agreed to limit the rise of climate change, or global temperatures rather, to 2 degrees C or 350 parts per million of CO2. What Copenhagen was unable to deliver was the consensus on how to. Domestically, putting a price on pollution is step one of that how-to. I have been in the energy and environmental trading markets for many years, and I want to share some history with you for the current debate. This is a sample of some of the government programs and mechanisms, and there is one date issue I would like you to hold through the timeline that I go through. John Howard and his coalition government were elected in 1996 to the 3rd of December in 2007. 1997, Australia made an international commitment at Kyoto to limit its greenhouse gas emissions growth to 108% of 1990 baselines. To assist in that commitment, the Australian Greenhouse was created within government, making it the world's first agency to dedicate to cutting greenhouse gas emissions. In 1998, the AGO was given standalone agency status to provide whole-of-government approach to greenhouse matters. In 2000, Gwen Andrews, talking at a conference in Europe, said, "Australia is engaged in a consultation process domestically on the establishment of a domestic emissions trading regime. If adopted, we intend that it would be fully integrated with the global regime once Kyoto Protocol comes into force. Such a system would have the effect of pricing carbon and driving emission reductions in an efficient and cost-effective way." She goes on to add, "We have released for public information 4 discussion papers on the domestic emissions trading regime. The first covers the boundaries of what a domestic scheme should cover. The second examines the issues surrounding permits. The third covers crediting of carbon, and the fourth looks at the design of the actual market." 2000, GGAP, Greenhouse Gas Abatement Program, another coalition program, committed $400 million over 4 years to assist Australia in meeting its Kyoto commitment to deliver least cost abatement. 2001, after more than 2 years of preparation and planning, the national 2% renewable energy target came into force. That's 2% renewables by 2010. This required every energy retailer to install renewable energy. In doing so, they can create RECs, or renewable energy certificates. 1 REC equals 1 megawatt hour of generation from a renewable source. There is a financial penalty for non-compliance. If the retailers do not install renewable energy, the other way they can meet their liability is buying RECs that are generated from other technologies and surrendering them against their liability. RECs are traded like shares. They are personal property. They are subject to supply and demand the same way shares are. To deal with climate change, that target has now been increased to 20% renewables by 2020. Bob Carr introduced GGAS, mentioned by Stuart. In New South Wales, this is one of the first emissions trading schemes in the world, not just in Australia, but in the world. And it is counted internationally towards Australia's Kyoto commitment. 90 tonnes of abatement. Greenbank bought credits at $13 in 2009, and they're worth $3.50 today. The best abatement is the cheapest abatement. In 2006, the Howard government introduced energy efficiency opportunities, where the top 500 companies had to report what opportunities they had to conserve energy. They had 2 years to get ready, so industry was eased into it with the first reporting year in 2008. The 29th of September 2007, that's September 2007, after years of consultation, government legislated National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting System. Top 500 again had to report on their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Again, easing into it, the first year of reporting was 2008 to 2009. We now have 2 sources of energy consumption data. 2009, the CPRS is history. 2011, the Clean Energy Futures is before Parliament as we speak, and so is not history. We have landscape environmental laws and compensation, which is another word for a tax or a make good provision. We have air quality laws and penalties for non-compliance, a tax. We have a consumption tax. We should have a cost on pollution of the atmosphere. We have a tax to rebuild Queensland. Staying with me on those dates, I think you will concede we have had and should have bipartisan support for both a carbon tax and the ensuing emissions trading scheme to deliver the least cost abatement of greenhouse gas because we are all paying for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for all you wonderful people coming here today to hear this debate, a very pertinent debate given the current political discourse in Australia. My name's Matthew Wright. I'm from Beyond Zero Emissions. It's a climate solutions think tank. It's volunteer run. It's a tax-deductible charity, and it's full of a bunch of fantastic, bright people who want to create the future they want to live and work in. And that's a future where we move from a 19th century fossil fuel economy to a 21st century renewable powered clean tech economy. A tax won't fix climate change. That's pretty clear. Firstly, I'll say the biggest and most important thing a tax will do, though, is it'll show the moral of the Chicken Little story. Well, that's how it was known of in the US. The Henny Penny or Chicken Licken story, as it's known in the UK, or what's soon to be known in Australia as the Tony Abbott story, still stands. And that is, if you're screaming, the sky will fall in. The sky will fall in. And and you keep on screaming that. The moral is, don't listen to a hysterical panic merchant who's screaming and telling you that the sky's going to fall in. Stop, take a rational assessment of the situation and work out how to deal with problems more effectively. And we can do that. In fact, there's 2 morals to the Chicken Licken Henny Penny story. And they are, one for the public, don't listen to everything you're told by the fossil fuel lobby. And for Tony Abbott, don't be a chicken, have courage. There's a very small amount, the second thing that's positive about it is that there's a very small amount of wealth redistribution in the carbon tax package. But it's very small, and we should be true to what John Howard said in 2001 about being an egalitarian country. We probably should be seeing more policies of wealth redistribution out of Canberra, such as a significant upscaling of mining and resource rent taxes. To fix climate change, we need to know what the likelihood of it having extreme impacts on us and future generations is. And we know the best, most well-resourced scientists are telling us that we need to act right away and decarbonise in a decade. According to Tim Flannery's Climate Commission, this is the critical decade. They've looked at the best climate science coming out of the Potsdam Institute in Germany, and if you want something done properly, you go and check what the Germans are doing. They tell us that a country like Australia, with over 20 tonnes per capita, we need to decarbonise within a decade. So what can we do to fix climate change? Well, we'll need to go 100% renewable energy right away, electrify our transportation, electrify commercial, industrial, domestic space and water heating with heat pumps. We need no more fossil fuels. That's no more smokestacks, no more tailpipes. It's simple and commercially available now. That's wind power, rooftop solar photovoltaic and large-scale baseload solar thermal plants with molten salt storage that are already deployed today in Spain and the US. Deregulation. I'm sure Sinclair, our final panellist, can tell us more about deregulation, because I often hear the Institute of Public Affairs speaking lots and lots about deregulation. I'm hoping that after my speech, in fact, that Sinclair, John Roscombe and Alan Moran will take on the distortive nature, the copious and inappropriate legislation that is holding back rooftop solar and wind in Australia. Rooftop solar. Today it's cheaper for all electricity consumers, whether you're an aluminium smelter up for contract, whether you're a domestic or commercial user, if we choose to pay hundreds of thousands of Australians to give up their roof space, pay a premium to them to generate solar power on the rooftops. And this is because of the resultant lowering of the underlying wholesale power price that you get from wedging extra solar power into the electricity market. It's now cheaper to get solar power off your roof than to buy it for the grid for everybody. That's because countries like, and it happened because countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain led the way doing the heavy lifting in building the industry by deploying millions of solar panels, resulting in massive cost reductions in the cost of these technologies. The citizens of most countries are reaping the benefits of solar-generated power, giving them, the citizens of those countries are reaping the benefits of solar-generated power, giving them lower power bills. This is all called the merit order effect. Look out for it. Right now, however, in Australia, there's some discriminatory government regulation standing in the way between you having your own solar power station on your roof and you remaining unfairly, solely reliant on the old 19th century vertically integrated energy companies such as AGL and Origin. Firstly, with wind power and deregulating there. The wind power industry has been bogged down with copious amounts of regulation for far too long, excessive community consultation studies and arduous planning processes. The worst of this has come in the form of the Liberal Baillieu government's regulation change last month, which creates a buffer of 2 kilometres around every house and locks up 95% of Victoria from having any wind turbines. The contrast with the coal seam gas or coal mines in Victoria is extreme. The buffer zone for a coal or gas mine is 0 metres. The government will literally let the coal and gas companies put you out of your house and home and replace your house with a dirty and dangerous fossil fuel resource extraction operation. Therefore, if we're physically creating an impossible planning process for wind and not appropriately compensating owners of solar systems who lower everybody's electricity bills, then we have to find out whether Australians really want to move from a 19th century fossil fuel-based economy to a 21st century clean tech economy. Do we really want to do this? Do we really want to solve climate change and be part of the global 21st century economy? Well, we know that Germany is the leading 21st century economy to shift to is leading the shift to renewable powered clean tech economies. And the US is heading up the efforts to keep us back in the 19th century fossil fuel-based economy, but where we're not close behind. So what do Australians want? To answer this question, I sent my staff, clipboards in hand, along to the Liberal Party State Conference. The results. More than 60% of Liberal members chose Mercedes and BMW, German, while less than 10% chose Ford and General Motors, American. Liberals had voted with their wallets. Let the market decide. The consumers have spoken. The Liberal members had chosen more than 5 to 1 to go for products from the leading 21st century renewable powered clean tech economy, Germany, and they're on their way to 100%, over products from the head of the old 19th century fossil fuel economy, the United States. Seriously, the big technical problem with the carbon tax is it's designed to shift Australia's economy incrementally from coal to gas, which isn't even half a solution. We've heard it from the horse's mouth, Grant King. He said explicitly that the point of the carbon tax is to go to gas. Likewise, Greg Combet has repeated that on Lateline. The point of the carbon tax is to go to gas, fossil fuel. Gas is polluting, it's dirty. They don't account properly for their fugitive emissions. Coal seam gas is stuffing our food bowls through destroying water resources. We'd be better off running any coal plant in the country for a few more years than jumping the gun and replacing it with gas. We need to go to cheap renewables rather than building fossil fuel infrastructure such as gas plants that will last 60 years belching carbon dioxide for 60 years. The shining light of the clean energy package is the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. However, the devil's in the detail. And whoever you turn to, Greens, Labor, the Independents, they all have a different take on what it will achieve. The first problem with it is that the clean energy is a euphemism for gas. So clean energy means gas. It's a marketing term created in the boardrooms of Origin, AGL and Santos. The CEFC needs to be renamed to the Renewable Energy Finance Corporation, the REFC. There should be no gas peakers, no gas combined cycle plants, no dirty gas cogeneration plants, no fossil fuel burning should be bankrolled by the REFC. Furthermore, the REFC, or what's currently known as the CFC, needs to grant, not just provide low-interest loans. 3 weeks ago, I accompanied Ross Garneau, Tony Windsor, to a baseload solar plant in Spain. And the interesting thing is every time I take Australians to see a baseload solar plant in Spain, their faces light up, they glow, because they realise this isn't a research and development project, it's not an innovation prototype. This is a huge commercial industry with $20 billion plants either operating or under constructions. We can go now to renewables, we can use a feed-in tariff to do it. We can go 100% renewable energy today with off-the-shelf technology, wind power, solar thermal with storage and photovoltaic. We know where the dozens of industrial facilities are emitting the carbon dioxide from. We know how to do this, so let's go.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for opening our case and making such a great point up front that the carbon tax, or a carbon tax, is simply honouring the polluter pays principle. As the Chief Climate Commissioner here in Australia, I must say I've heard thousands of opinions from ordinary Australians in recent months about this issue. Many of them against, but also many for. And the one thing I've learnt as I've gone around the country listening to people is that Greek philosopher Plato was essentially right when he said that the great mass of people deal with opinion. It's only the gods and maybe one or two humans who deal intelligently with facts. And one of the big problems we have, of course, in this debate is uninformed opinion. And that's why we have experts, those one or two godlike people who should guide our thinking. Their thoughts are summarised in places like the Australian Academy of Sciences website, and yet many of us prefer to ignore them for reasons that are unclear to me. What I'd like to do with my 8 minutes is just look at the carbon tax through the lens of history, because history has happened, we can analyse it, we can use it as a guide. And history has a lot to say about the polluter pays principle. In fact, our civilisation is only here today because in the past we have honoured that principle. First, of course, we need to ask ourselves what pollution is. History teaches us that it's usually something that comes out of the rear end of something, yeah? And in deep history it was usually an animal or a human being. I think about that very first village, the first moment that people settled down in a place for more than a night. They were no longer nomads. And little Johnny deciding to relieve himself just outside the newly built hut. I'm sure he got a kick up the backside from Mum. It was probably the first energy price ever paid, or sorry, the first pollution price ever paid by anybody. And doubtless he learned his lesson. Otherwise we wouldn't have villages, we wouldn't have cities as we have today. Of course, Mum's kick didn't solve the problem. You've only got to look at the state of 19th century European cities, or cities anywhere in the world, in fact, to see how little was done about the problem. One British naval officer who visited Lisbon recorded walking down the narrow streets with the 3 or 4 storey buildings there and people emptying their night soil out of the windows. He was made, rather to his surprise, an admiral, receiving 5 stripes on each shoulder before his time. Of course, the lady who'd made him an admiral, or the maid, could have taken her chamber pot down outside the town and emptied it onto the seaside or into the local creek. She didn't, because that was a bit of an effort and no one was forcing her to pay a pollution price. And that example, I think, should convince us all that voluntarism simply doesn't work. In these instances, people won't even take small efforts by themselves when they see others polluting willy-nilly and not paying the price. In the modern world, pollution has many forms, and as we've dealt with pollution time and again, we have learnt, and the economists have taught us, that a price is important, but that the most effective way to deliver that price is through a market-based mechanism. And that's for a very simple reason. If a government regulator tells you what you have to do, What that implies is that some bureaucrat in some distant city knows your business better than you do and tells you how to do something. Whereas if you're the person running the business and you can see ways of reducing the pollution cost effectively, you'll do it in the most cost effective manner. It's something we've learnt as markets have gone on over time. Another thing we've learnt is that economists are actually pretty bad at trying to calculate the impact of imposing a price. Dr. Feinstein in the United States has published a study of pollution regulation on everything from asbestos to vinyl and has shown that consistently, time and again, the projected cost of abating the pollution was more than twice the actual cost. And that's because when the market is brought into play, people find innovative solutions to the problem. People who intimately know that particular process find ways of dealing with it. In some instances that Feinstein documented, the cost was 1/70th that of the projected cost. So I don't think when people talk about the projected burden on business and all the rest of dealing with a carbon price and abating carbon pollution, we should take too grim a view on it. History teaches us that we are an innovative people who find ways of dealing with this problem. And of course, pollution is, or carbon pollution is something that comes out of the rear end of something. It comes out of the rear end of a coal-fired power plant or a gas plant. And if I could just return to Stuart's point about whether we should be overly concerned in Australia with trying to tax our exports of coal or natural gas, I just point out to you, Stuart, that at that point it isn't pollution yet. Yeah? It hasn't come out of the rear end of something. It's only when people burn it, use the energy that it provides, and then put the gas out of the rear end of their plant that it becomes pollution. So quite rightly, they should pay, not Australia. And of course, it would be very difficult for us to impose a cost in any case. I've heard many devious and interesting arguments from Australians, ordinary Australians, about the problems with paying a carbon price. One of the most common we hear these days is that, well, Australia's only 1.5% of the global problem. Even if we abated our emissions greatly, it wouldn't have any impact on the atmosphere, so why would you bother? And I remember having an audience like this, and that question was asked, and one of our commissioners stood up and said, "Well, madam, do you ever contribute to charity?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "What sort of charities?" "Oh, helping the starving in Africa." And he said, "How much would you generally give?" "Oh, $50, $100. And he said, "Do you think that'll solve the problem of the starving in Africa?" Of course we give to charity on the same basis that we undertake our fair share of carbon abatement, on the understanding that others will join us and the problem will be dealt with. The same principle is there. We have to have faith in each other. If we don't have faith in each other to do the right thing, we simply won't have a civilisation. Exactly the same outcome will prevail if we don't honour the polluter pays principle. Over the last week or so, I've been travelling with a number of international visitors in Australia, looking at what's happening around the world. And what they told me has absolutely convinced me that Australia is not acting alone, nor are we acting ahead of the rest of the world. Dr. Zhang Qichun from the NDRC in China, which is the government agency tasked with dealing with carbon pollution, has informed us that by 2015, 5 trial carbon trading schemes will be operating in China. They will cover a population of around 250 million people. In one state alone, one province alone, over 1,500 large emitters will be controlled under that scheme, regulated under that scheme, and be forced to pay. And China is looking at the rest of the world for models upon which to base that great experiment. Some provinces will be run under a European model, some under the Californian trading scheme model, some under the Australian model. He thinks this is being sorted at this very moment. It brought home 2 big points to me. One, that things are being done on an enormous scale overseas. And secondly, that what Australia does really does count. Dr. Zhang made the point emphatically that China is looking at Australia so as to learn from our experiences and apply them within China. An expert from California told us that California, the 8th largest economy on the planet, has an emissions trading scheme which will begin next year. The likely price on carbon, $25 to $30. I suspect that by the end of this decade we'll be approaching a situation where a global carbon market will be a reality, and Australia will benefit greatly from doing its bit in terms of making the polluter pay. Thank you very much.
Sinclair Davidson.
Good evening. If I could add my thanks to everybody coming here tonight. I actually just want to make two very simple points in the time that I have available to me, and that the first is that the carbon tax will fail to fix climate change because it is at odds with human nature and also at odds with our institutions. Now, I'm actually happy to concede the neoliberal economic position. Neoclassical economics basically makes the argument that a pollutant with the long-lived characteristics of carbon dioxide is best managed by a tax. Not a cap and trade, which what the Gillard government is actually introducing after a couple of years, but actually just by a tax. Now, this result was first published by Martin Weitzman of Harvard University, formerly of MIT and formerly of Yale University in 1974. It's a stock standard theoretical result. We teach it to our students, and I think I'm happy to admit there it is. This model, however, is reliant on some of the kind of economic assumptions which get theoretical economists into trouble, and we know the kind of trouble that economics gets into, we're just having coming out of a recession. Now, if we think that a cap and trade is a good system, and I'm saying to you, well, actually it isn't for carbon dioxide, how do I then explain the sulfur dioxide problem and the resolution of acid rain in the United States? Now, sulfur dioxide, turns out, is a very different pollutant to carbon dioxide. Sulfur dioxide is a short light flow pollutant, whereas carbon dioxide is a long-lived stock pollutant. Now, sulfur dioxide very quickly combines with water vapor coming down as rain and can be solved by a local tax. The carbon dioxide, however, is a global problem and will not be solved by Australia having a local tax. We would need to have some sort of global tax for that, and I will touch on that if I have a moment. Now, imagine a matrix where we ask ourselves two questions. The first question is anthropogenic global warming occurring? And the second question is, do we really know what we're doing? Now, I'm going to accept the IPCC position and say there's a 90% probability that anthropogenic global warming is occurring. That leaves us with the do we really know what we're doing? Well, let's go 50-50. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. On those characteristics, we would actually end up with only a 45% chance of getting the policy right. Now, if you care about the environment, you want to make sure that we have a much better chance than 45% of getting it right. And I'm going to put to you tonight that putting in a carbon tax is not the correct policy. Now, climate change is really an economic, moral, political, and technological problem. I want to concentrate on two assumptions that we make when we're making up our policies. Now, technocrats make these assumptions, and they are inherent in a lot of public policy, and these two assumptions are why it's going to fail. Now, the advantage of a carbon price, as Tim has indicated, is that people respond to incentives. Now, the carrot is so much better than the stick. But carrots and sticks are used to incentivize donkeys. This is a short-term solution. Donkeys don't vote. And that's actually an important part of the story. Now, the first part of the first assumption that we have is that technocrats assume a benevolent dictator. Now, our benevolent dictator making policy is swayed by the kind of sensible, rational arguments that we keep on hearing about. This benevolent dictator also has a very long time horizon. Now, the fact of the matter is that we don't have benevolent dictators. We live in a democracy with relatively short time horizons. Now, keep that at the back of your mind. The second assumption that we have relates to human nature. Climate change policy, as articulated, generally speaking, makes a very strong moral assumption. That moral assumption is that we are strict egalitarians, that we care about other people and especially future generations as much as we care about ourselves. Egalitarianism, as understood in Australia, is that people should be treated with dignity and respect, but we're actually making a far stronger assumption. Now, this reminds us of the story of the Good Samaritan. I think we all know the story. The lesson of the Good Samaritan, however, isn't that we're all neighbours and should love each other. The lesson of the Good Samaritan is to remember that it was a parable. There never actually was a Good Samaritan. The story of the Good Samaritan is that we should be better people, not that we are better people. And the sad reality is that we don't care enough about each other. As Tim said to us, people won't make small efforts. Now, let us think, why are these small efforts important? Well, as Lord Stern said in his report, if you care little about future generations, you will care little about climate change. So, do we care about future generations? And the answer is sadly, no, we don't. Now, we're all here going to say tonight, well, of course we love our children and our grandchildren, and of course we want to pay so that they can have a better world. But think about this. We live in a society where sending children to school is compulsory because otherwise people might not. We live in a society where people will not pay for their children's school fees. We live in a society where you are forced to save for your own retirement. I mean, we don't even love our future selves, let alone future generations. So how does this work? How can we make this argument? Now, if we think about how meagre our donations to charity are, how few people donate blood, how few people donate organs, how little we give in foreign aid, how poorly we treat asylum seekers, it is a bit of a long stretch to say that we're going to love future generations as much as we self. We simply do not. So the policy that relies upon this important moral assumption actually violates our basic human nature. Now, I'm not making some sort of behavioral finance or behavioral economics assumption argument about hyperbolic discounting for those of you into that sort of thing. I'm just saying how people are. Now, if we want to have a successful policy, we have to think how people are. This tax will not survive sustained contact with the electorate. It imposes costs now, and it has benefits far, far into the future. People understand that. And the more that we understand about the tax, the more we understand about the problems of climate change, the more detail we see, the less we like the solutions, the less involved people are. This is because it interacts poorly with our basic human nature. This is an incredible paradox that people simply don't understand. Why, when the details of the tax come out, people turn off? Well, they don't like what they see. In a democracy, you don't have to put up with what you don't like. The long disconnect between the timing of the costs and the realization of the benefits undermines our willingness to pay this particular tax. It is true, early intervention is the lowest cost option to society, but society is made up of individuals. It's not the cheapest cost to us. It is the cheapest cost to society as a whole. A very, very different thing. Future generations don't vote. This tax will be unpopular. It will be repealed at a future election, if not the coming election, the one after that, the one after that. Over time, we will see the tax pain will be eroded and the welfare aspects of the tax will be expanded. That is human nature. Now, I don't want you to go home being disappointed. You don't go home with nothing. The solution to climate change isn't mitigation, but adaptation. The best preparation for any natural disaster is wealth accumulation. Now, you're going to say to me, climate change is not a natural disaster. Well, no, it isn't. Thank you. But nonetheless, it's very like a natural disaster. So, increased wealth will allow future generations to confront the problem on their own terms and not on our terms. Self-insurance, not government insurance, is the solution to this. We need to expand our economy, grow our wealth as much as possible, because ultimately the environment is a superior good. Rich people value the environment more than do poor people. If you want people to care about the environment, to do the right thing about the environment, you want to get rich and not be poor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Adam, in your absence you were introduced and I didn't get a chance to brief you, so it's a bell after 8 minutes to speak within a total of 9. Ladies and gentlemen, now that he's made it here, probably a pretty hectic journey, please welcome Adam Bandt.
Thanks very much. As you can tell, I've just flown back in from Canberra, and we were stuck on the tarmac for 20 minutes because the booking system was down and they double booked someone and had to bring them off from the back of the plane, something I'm assured never will happen on high-speed rail if we ever get that up and running between Melbourne and Sydney. But the other thing I've just come back from Canberra where we've been debating the introduction of 18 pieces of legislation that make up a clean energy package, the likes of which Australia hasn't seen. And if you follow only the media debate, you would think it is all about the very narrow politics of the government versus the opposition. And that would run the risk, and we potentially lose sight of this very significant moment in Australia and the world's history that we are in right now, because for the first time, after decades of discussion on the need for action, we now have a comprehensive package of national measures to make a start in tackling climate change. And a key part of that is putting a price on pollution, or as is referred to in the debate tonight, a carbon tax. Now, for the first time, we also have a pollution reduction target of cutting our emissions by 80% by 2050 that is close to what the scientists and the Climate Commission say is needed, which is a net zero emissions economy in Australia by 2040. For the first time, we have a climate change authority that will make recommendations every year on how much of the carbon budget we've got left to get us to that target. For the first time, we will have a price on pollution that will make renewable energy relatively cheaper. And that is the key point, and I'll come back to that a couple of times. And for the first time, we have a well-funded agency whose sole focus is the promotion of renewable energy, as well as, and this is important, a publicly funded green bank that can invest in clean energy and leverage billions of dollars in private sector investment as well. And I think that this very significant step towards Australia making its contribution to cutting pollution and a global fight against climate change started here in Melbourne. And it's lovely to finally be back here discussing this important topic, because unless Melbourne had shown leadership, we wouldn't even be having this debate. Because Melbourne voted the way it did and the rest of the country voted the way it did, we were able to put a price on pollution, or a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme, as one of our key conditions for supporting the government. And we did this because whilst we agree with the arguments that I know that some of the others may have made, that a price on pollution alone won't be enough to fix climate change, it is the case that we will not be able to fix climate change without one. What is a price on pollution? Well, it's simply saying that up until now, we have assumed that we could put as much pollution into the atmosphere as we want for free and that it would come at no cost. We weren't doing that because there was a cabal of people in their underground lairs who were all sat around plotting, saying, how can we produce energy in the most polluting way? We just all thought since the Industrial Revolution that it was okay to do it and that it would come at no cost to us, either now or in the future. But we now know that that's not true. We now know that the Great Barrier Reef has bleached more time in the 1970s than it did prior to the 1970s. We now know that sea levels are rising more than many people had expected. We now know that the predictions of cyclones and bushfires that we have seen are consistent with some of the predictions about what will happen if climate change gets underway. And we know it is going to get worse. But because it changes the relative price of clean energy versus dirty energy, a price is an essential part of driving investment decisions and raising revenue that can be directed to cutting pollution and investing in renewables. And it's a crucial platform on which further action can be built in the energy efficiency of buildings, transport and other areas of the economy. And that's why, in some sense, I find the whole debate about the perspectives of so-called direct action versus a price, as if it's a dichotomy, is quite a strange one, because it's not the way we deal with other polluting substances. Take tobacco, for example. We now know that smoking causes enormous damage and is a major risk to health. And despite the misinformation and fear campaigns peddled by big tobacco, successive governments have sought to reduce, significantly curb and eventually get smoking down to zero. When we discuss the policy measures needed to solve the smoking problem, we don't say, are you a direct action kind of guy, or do you just believe price is going to do it? We don't suggest that putting a price on cigarettes is somehow in conflict with education and health sector innovation or direct investment. We do everything. We jack up the price. We put doctors on the warpath. We put ads on TV and pictures of cancer on packets of cigarettes. And conversely, does anyone believe, seriously, that all those investments would be of any effect if the price of cigarettes was $2 a packet? And so it is with pollution. And it's not just the decisions about how we as individuals consume and what sources of energy we consume, whether it's clean or dirty, but it will also start to impact on investment. If you've got a spare several $1 billion lying around, as I'm sure many of you do, and you're looking for a place to invest in Australia and you want to invest in the energy sector, your choice from now on will be, do I invest in something that is going to have a price put on it that I know is going to continue and is going to rise, or will I invest in clean energy where I know it will be tax and price free? And that is exactly the kind of signal, both to individuals and investors, that a price on pollution or a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme does. Now, I completely agree, as I said, that we need a complementary range of policies to get there. It's always struck me as astounding that when the global financial crisis hit, governments around the world of all political stripes were able to get together within a fortnight and find well over $1 trillion to bail out the banks. Yet when it comes to climate change, we're always prepared to put off and put off and put off, to the point where we now have almost 2 decades of global negotiations going on. It's my faint hope that at some stage governments around the world are going to start treating the planet with the same courtesy that we do merchant banks. And if we did that, we might start getting there. But if throughout all of that, if fossil fuels and coal stays cheap, we are going to keep using it. Listening to Sinclair Davidson, I was reminded of Groucho Marx, who said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" And if that's right, if his argument is right, well, you might as well disband all the schools now because they're only concerned about investing in kids for the future. You might as well shut down all the hospitals because that's about people who haven't even been born yet. And every one of you should stop going to your kids' and grandkids' birthday party and putting in time to make them better people because you won't be around to enjoy it. The reality is that the real opposition to a price on pollution is often based on a genuine desire to cut pollution, but I know certainly Matthew is someone with a desire to do that. We often have a situation where carbon price deniers, are those who want to protect polluters or have accepted the arguments of the climate deniers. There is the argument alluded to by Sinclair that somehow climate change is not real enough. Now, that is ultimately an argument about risk. Even if you believe that climate change is not real, or there is a 10% chance, or whatever tortuous mathematics was used, you must confront the question of what if you're wrong? Because if you are wrong, and if what the climate scientists say is correct, then one is taking a very enormous risk with the future of the economy and the people of this country and the planet and the environment. Those who oppose the price on pollution say it's okay, that we're willing to run the risk, regardless of the impacts of floods, sea level rises and droughts and other calamities. And we don't adopt this approach in other areas. We don't say, I can't tell you if Australia is ever going to be invaded, where the invading forces will land and who they will be, therefore we don't need a defence force. And you don't get to the end of the year and say, my goodness, my house didn't burn down, wasn't that a waste of insurance money? I hope my house burns down next year. We adopt a precautionary principle, and so should it be with climate change. And I don't believe that the people of Melbourne want us to drag our heels. At the last election, I went to it saying we could shift Melbourne to 100% clean renewable energy, including a price on pollution. And I asked people to imagine an MCG covered in solar panels and community solar farms on the roofs of factories and schools, and how we'd expand public transport and maintain our mobility with electric vehicles. And I found that people understood that we needed to be willing to face up to the risks of climate change and lead. We will begin to put the real price on pollution that is needed if we're to start shifting where we get our energy from, how we move around the country and how we make our things. And we will transform our economy and our society into a much more prosperous and sustainable place in the process.
Well, thank you, everybody. A fascinating range of views. It's now the opportunity for those of you in the audience who'd like to influence this debate by your contribution to speak. What we will do, as we have in past times, is take speakers for the proposition that a carbon tax will not fix the climate and speakers against. You get up to a minute to speak. In that time, I hope that you'll put your own arguments, but if you feel that you need to ask a question or simply just make a comment, then that's also available. So is there anybody who would like to come forward? There are microphones here in the sort of central areas. You can see people raising their hands. You'll need to come out from your chair if you'd like to speak. First of all, we're going to go with a speaker for the proposition. So is there anybody who wants to speak for this side?
Question for the panel.
Right, well, hang on, just because you're there doesn't mean you get to speak. I want to find out, first of all, is there anybody who wants to speak for? Yes, over there. So you take precedence if you're speaking for the proposition, then I'll come back to you. No? Yes? I'm sure it's for. Okay, your name, please?
My name is Kate Thorley. I just wanted to put forward the idea that most of the debate so far has rested on the assumption that pricing carbon is the policy solution that we're looking for. I'd just like to say that I currently work in Europe, campaigning on the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and what's become very obvious there is that pricing carbon is not a solution to climate change in any sense. The OECD last week actually released a report admitting that pricing carbon is not working, and that the scale, severity and speed that climate change is moving at and that we need to respond in shows that we need much more drastic solutions. Adam pointed out that it's not a dichotomy of pricing or direct action, but the problem we're seeing in Europe is that the pricing debate, whether it's around emissions trading or carbon taxing, is obscuring any other action. So we're not seeing other action. So if the panel wants to respond at all to my point, I'd like to ask, what are the other policies that are standing alongside pricing pollution if there are other ones?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And feel free to applaud people who give us speech. That was a good one. Okay. So we're going to take a question now, I think, and then we'll go to a speaker against. So your name?
Yep, my name's Michael. First, I just want to say that if only Parliament was as civilised and as direct as tonight. But my question to the panel is, in addition to, I guess, pricing mechanisms for pollution, what do you think about the idea of thorium nuclear power as a potential replacement for fossil fuel altogether?
So what was it? What sort of power?
Thorium nuclear power.
Thorium.
Yeah.
Okay, thorium reactors instead of uranium reactors. Thank you for that. I'll now take a speaker against the motion. Is there somebody who would like to speak against? Okay, so your name, please.
Hi, my name is Gordon Young. I have a question for Matthew. Firstly, congratulations. I think what you're doing is amazing. And I have to say I agree with you. We should be doing all the things you put in your report. However, given we're having an enormous debate at the moment and enormous resistance against, frankly, a fairly toothless carbon tax, do you seriously believe that there is any viable alternative to this current proposition?
Okay, thanks. Just in terms of these questions, so you know, I'm going to take a few speakers first and then I'm going to come back to the panel and they'll have an opportunity to speak. So, Matthew, one there for you specifically. I'll come to you. Generally, a question about thorium we'll come back to. That was a speaker for. So, a speaker against the motion? What do you want to do? Because you've been there a while. Is against? Okay, yeah, thanks.
Hello? Yep. So I'm sure, my name's Dan.
Great.
Thank you. I got ahead of myself there. Like most people here, I think climate change is a serious issue that requires significant social, economic change. I don't think a simple carbon tax will do that. I believe that unpopular decisions are a really important part of leadership, a vital part of leadership, but not if they're too unpopular. And the tax is proving to be pretty unpopular. On the other hand, investing in infrastructure, buying Australian-made products, supporting Australian industry, even protectionism from both sides of politics apparently is popular. So given this, and given the historic role that governments have played in building energy infrastructure in Australia, there's no privately built coal power stations in Australia, I think there's a strong argument to be made for government today building renewable energy infrastructure across the country, similar to what Matt has pointed out. It's doable today, and I think this will be more effective at addressing climate change and more effective at building support. Let's do this today. Let's not wait for a weak carbon price to do it decades later.
Okay, thank you. That was a speech for. And I'm going to take one more against, and then we're going to go and have a response from the panel. So somebody wants to speak against. No one wants to speak against the motion on this side? Okay, on that basis, well, that's interesting actually. So we'll just pause for a moment then and get some responses. Matthew, the question that was specifically directed to you, how do you respond?
Yeah, look, a viable alternative to the current carbon price package is to actually have feed-in tariffs funded on our electricity bills, which lower the underlying wholesale power price. So they lower the power price for all electricity consumers by reducing the wholesale price volatility, reducing the peak spikes, which, for instance, on the terrible Black Saturday in Victoria, $700 million was traded in the electricity market. 30% of the total year electricity traded was on that day when over 100 people lost their lives. So the electricity companies were cashing in while Australians were losing their lives. And that's a system that doesn't have the good tempered regulation of having solar PV, which correlates with our peaks. And that's what that would do for us. It would actually lower our electricity bills.
You want us to go cold turkey on fossil fuels. Are you attracted at all to the question about a thorium-based nuclear cycle?
No, actually, my father was trained as a nuclear physicist, and I used to be into nuclear power as a child. And I remember India had this program 20 years ago, and I was told about how in 5 years' time India was going to crack thorium reactors. Well, people came up to me yesterday. I was at an AMA conference, speaking at an AMA group of doctors, and someone came up and said thorium, and he said, in 5 years we're going to have thorium reactors. And I said, well, hang on,
they'll be right.
I've heard that somewhere before.
What about you guys? Any enthusiasm over here for thorium as opposed to uranium? No. What about you, Adam? You're not tempted?
No, I've had the privilege of meeting some pretty amazing people in this job since I've been elected, and one of them was the climate advisor to the German Chancellor and to the G8, who said, I cannot believe, and neither can all of my colleagues, that you Australians aren't leading the world in renewable energy technology. Look at the intellectual resources that you've got, look at the manufacturing capacity that you've got, look at the fact that you've got all this sun and all this land. Why aren't you doing that? And I just think we've got a free source and we've got proven technology now, so to start punting on speculative technology that we don't even work is a complete waste of money.
And Tim, a young woman, I can't remember her name, I'm sorry, but saying the OECD report recently saying don't put your eggs into the carbon tax basket. Is that something you've heard or do you have a response to?
Look, I haven't seen that particular report, but I have seen the US-German Marshall Fund assessment of the European ETS, which suggested it was working. It was reducing emissions at the rate that were required under the scheme and was going forward. But in terms of Europe, don't just look at the EU ETS, there's many other mechanisms there. Sweden, for example, has a carbon tax of $140 a tonne. Australian, it's already reduced its carbon emissions by 50% below 1990 levels and is well on the way to becoming a carbon-free economy. So it depends on the kind of scheme you're looking at and you know, the kind of price people are paying for the speed of this sort of thing.
Okay, yeah, Fiona?
I just wanted to add for the lady from Europe, the scheme in Europe, they overestimated their emissions in the first place and then they over-allocated permits. Under NGERS, the National Greenhouse Emissions System, we have to actually measure the consumption and we have to actually measure the emissions. So it's not an estimate, it's actual data.
A speaker against the motion? Anyone there? Yes, over here please.
My name's Alison and I'm a national politics student, and whilst I agree with Matthew's statements that we do need to move to renewable energy and that these facilities are available to us, I'd just like to point out that Australians are a deliberately uninformed bunch of people due to the nature of our political system here. And I think that whilst it's good to have pipe dreams about fast action right now, Australians probably wouldn't respond very well to that kind of change. Whereas the government now is taking a very difficult stance against the Australian electorate, which is not very popular. Could you imagine such a big change going down so well in the political environment that, you know, Australia is?
Sorry, just before you go, did you say that we are a deliberately uninformed people? Winning friends and influencing people.
Just politically, and that's to do with the political system. I mean, you see it now. You've got the opposition and the government going head to head, and we only see what the media wants us to see. But it's the informed bunch here, maybe, that can make a difference.
Thank you. We all choose it, so it's right. So you're speaking for the motion, yes? Okay.
My name is Margarita and I teach at Victoria University, Community Development. First thing I would like to say is that a lot of countries, especially Pacific Island countries and other third world countries, did not consider Copenhagen as a success story, but it was actually completely difficult for them, and they said that the capping of 2 degrees would actually see their island sink. They were arguing for 1.5% maximum increase. Now, the argument I want to make is the fact that if we put the market in charge of fixing climate change, it's like putting the cat in charge of looking after the mouse. And the reason I'm saying that is precisely because of our, 200 years of market-dominated policies, corporate globalization, colonialism, whatever you want to say. I would suggest we are in the predicament that we are in, and where the economy has suffered tremendously, and third world countries are really at the forefront of climate change and the suffering. To suggest that the market is going to fix this problem, why then do we see the economy in such a disastrous state? Global financial crisis, all of that. If the market was such a wonderful solution, we surely wouldn't be in the predicament we're in now.
Somebody who wants to speak against? Anyone down there? Yes, and against. And then I'm going to have one more of each. Were you waving down there wanting to speak? You'll have to go to a microphone, so if you want to do it, it won't come to you. So head on down. Yes, sir.
Hi there, yep. My name's Joey. First, in regards to Sinclair, he said that donkeys don't vote, and I'm from Frankston. They do.
So there.
It seems to me that the argument here is that a tax won't fix climate change. And this is just a question for the panel in general. Many for the affirmative, have stated very clearly that a tax would actually resolve climate change, just not this one. So in regards to the topic, do you think that a tax, perhaps not this one, but another form of this tax, would actually address the issue? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Don't answer now. We'll come back to you when you're summing up. And I think, sir, you're going to be the last. Is this somebody over there? Is there too? Okay, we'll have 2 last speakers. So you, sir, and then the one there.
My name is Warwick. I went to university more than 50 years ago. I did a bit of chemistry there, and I seem to remember finding out that burning gas, natural gas or something similar, to produce a certain amount of energy was a lot less polluting than burning coal. I'd just like to ask Matthew how he can say, contrary to what Grant King of Origin has said, that using natural gas is much less polluting than using a coal-fired system.
Okay, thank you. Again, Matthew, when you come to you summing up, if you can answer the Grant King question, because you had quite a crack at gas and all things associated with it. And last speaker, sir. Yes, your name?
Hey, my name's Dave. I come from an agricultural background from which the understanding is a carbon tax will more than likely kill part of the old farmers, the small businesses in the industry. And we're not really an industry which can adapt as the electrical industry can, to my understanding. Were there any solutions for that, and does the carbon tax deal with that is probably more of the question, because currently, from my understanding and from people back home, it's only just going to hurt us without helping fix our end of the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. I will, before we do the summing up and the voting, get a response from, I don't know, Adam or Tim. There is a real fear out in the bush that the carbon tax is going to decimate agricultural communities in this land. Well-founded, or is it? Is there? How do you answer? Well, either of you can answer.
I might just respond briefly about the package, and then maybe Tim can add to it. But the agriculture is not included in the trading scheme, so it won't be people who are working on the land aren't liable entities, etc. But one of the things that there is there as part of the scheme that we really pushed for is $1 billion to go towards a biodiversity fund. And there's also going to be a separate stream of what's called the carbon farming initiative that's going to encourage, through incentives, farmers to start having more sustainable practices, and they can make money out of it. But the scheme, but farming and agriculture itself is not included in the scheme.
Yeah, look, I think that there is a huge amount of misinformation out there, and I hear what you're saying about rural communities being scared about this. But the reality is, as Adam put it, you're not going to be bearing a tax. Agriculture is excluded. Fuel on farm, except for, I think, large trucks, is also excluded. And there are all the benefits that come in the carbon farming initiative. And just to give you one example of that, I'm involved with a non-for-profit organisation that seeks to preserve biodiversity in Australia, and we think that across our properties we'll be getting, through good fire management, something on the order of $50,000 to $100,000 a year from our carbon sequestration. And these are old pastoral properties. That's right. These are old pastoral properties that are now turned to biodiversity and properly managed for fire. But of course, fire management can be done on existing pastoral properties as well. And there's good CSIRO studies on cattle properties in Northern Australia showing that there's potential money made there. There'll be many other instances in other parts of Australia. So I'm quite confident that rural Australia will do well out of the changes.
Before people vote, Matthew, your view about the response to the gentleman asking about why you're so hard on gas.
There was the woman and the gas. Quick response. Okay, firstly, for the woman who said, is it too much? Well, actually, we've got 200 trained public speakers delivering talks in Rotary clubs, Lions clubs, church groups, you name it, around the country. They're trained public speakers, volunteers like you guys, and every time we give a talk about 100% renewables, the audiences love it. In terms of gas, and Grant King, our friend at Origin, basically gas is polluting. It's fugitive emissions. When they do well workovers, when they do well completion, when they actually put hundreds of thousands of gas wells across New South Wales and Queensland to get coal seam gas out, they're actually emitting a huge amount of methane, which is much more emissions intensive than when you actually combust the gas. And so when you change from a coal plant to a gas plant, you're actually not getting the savings they're quoting. And I'll give you another look at it in terms of, even if their accounting was true, what they're reporting to us, if you had 10 coal plants and you replaced it with 10 gas plants, it'd be the equivalent of having 5 coal plants worth of emissions. But where do you get your 6th coal plant worth of saving? You have to start retiring gas plants now. And if people are willing to defend really crappy 1950s coal plants today with millions of dollars in their marketing budgets and lobbying and public relations, then imagine what they'd do to defend a top-notch 2011 General Electric or Siemens combined cycle gas plant. They'll spend hundreds of millions of dollars.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, feel free to applaud if you agree with him. We've held a lot of votes in the debates we've had over the years, but I think this is going to be a particularly significant one because, as has been mentioned, this is now actually being discussed in the Parliament. So a group of people who've heard the arguments here, I encourage you to think seriously as you go to cast your ballot. Now, as you cast your vote, I'm going to ask each of the speakers in the order in which they spoke to spend up to 2 minutes summing up. It's a bit of a disadvantage for Adam because he's going to be going last and you may have already cast your vote. But it starts with you, Stuart. Your 2 minute begins now.
I'm going to tread very... Can you hear me? I'm going to tread very carefully, but I actually can't go past Tim's Neanderthal night soiling Johnny. And really this whole debate is not about ends. I think we're agreed about ends. It's about means. So let me just take an evolutionary step here. Tim alluded to kicking Johnny up the backside. I see that as a tax. Sinclair talked about enlightened self-interest. Well, if we roll that forward to the 21st century, that is, Johnny, if you didn't defecate on your back step, the odours in your bedroom on an evening might be quite pleasant. And if we look at an incentive-based mechanism, it would be, Johnny, if you use the flush toilet, I'll buy you a new iPod. So I think that's fundamentally the point here. We're talking about sticks and carrots. I posed a question at the start of my speech. Seriously for a moment, would you pay a polluter to reduce their emissions? Of course, that's exactly what the carbon tax does. But what it's doing, it's making an incentive payment to large growing economies like China, Brazil, India, when we're applying penalties to our own manufacturing sector. I find this quite bizarre. If we had an incentive scheme, we would legitimately be paying our own manufacturing base to remove and reduce their carbon emissions and retool for a low-energy future. And we would be doing that because we are using an incentive-based scheme, which is exactly like the New South Wales greenhouse gas abatement scheme was, but which unfortunately Maurice Yemmer got slapped down by the government. So to me, that really is the nub of it. Do you want an incentive scheme which encourages outperformance, or do you want a penalty scheme that encourages minimalist compliance?
Thank you. Fiona O'Hehir.
I'd just like to finish with that complementary measures like the renewable energy target is an implicit price on carbon, whilst the ETS is an explicit price on carbon. These two prices will drive change. Used together, the renewable energy target and the price on carbon, we will actually be able to drive change. This is a complex debate which demands our full attention and some clear thinking. After 10 years of consultation and preparation, starting with a soft landing with a 2-year tax on carbon, leading to a fully functioning ETS, Australia deserves bipartisan outcomes from our political process.
Your 2 minutes begin now, Matthew.
Look, I just want to reiterate that there's already too much carbon in the atmosphere today driving dangerous climate change. And it's highly risky waiting till 2040 to zero emissions. We actually need to decarbonise as soon as we can. So a decade would be a better approach. I want to tell you all that photovoltaic, rooftop solar, is already cheaper than supply-side power from large generators when delivered at your meter. This is because of the merit order effect. Look it up. It lowers the wholesale underlying power price for all consumers, and it lowers your bills. Baseload solar plants are already here, so don't listen to the fossil fuel lobby when they say it's all too hard, the wheels will fall off industry, the sky will fall in, we'll lose all our jobs, and so on. It's rubbish. We can do it. We're the can-do team. We can do it now. Germany has 20,000 wind turbines in an area the size of New South Wales. We've got a ban in Victoria on getting wind turbines. With just 8,000 wind turbines across the entire country, we could get half our electricity from wind. And Australia's a big place at 7 million square kilometres. An analogy for you, if a primary school has asbestos, then should we wait until someone gets mesothelioma or asbestosis in 30 years, or should we remove the asbestos now? Because the likelihood of death once you get that mesothelioma is 100%. So what do we do for our children? Do we remove the asbestos? And I reckon we would, and we have. Finally, gas is a diversion, not a shortcut. Let that be clear. Gas is a diversion, not a shortcut. The only viable alternative is renewable energy. It can be done with government bonds like someone suggested, or it can be done with feed-in tariffs. So let's go ahead and do it.
Thank you. Jim? Your 2 minutes start now, Tim.
Thank you. Look, we've only heard one argument from the opposition table there. All of them have tried to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Stuart talked about inefficiencies in the system. Matthew was saying that what we're doing is not good enough. Sinclair was saying that do we really know what we were doing and what are the chances of that? All adds up to the same thing. Make the perfect the enemy of the good and you won't do the good. But Stuart, you had me confused at times, talking about CDMs as incentive schemes. It totally avoids the point that somebody has to pay. We have to decide whether the polluter will pay or whether the public will pay. My perspective is that the polluter needs to pay. There's problems with international credit schemes, sure, but there is with every international transaction. And you talk about only 150 million tonnes of abatement in Australia. Only? That's a reduction of 29%. Of where we are over a business-as-usual case. That would be a great achievement if we could get there. Now, Matthew, I wasn't sure whether you were arguing for us or against us at times. I'm not sure about the gas issue, but I do think that we can't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And Sinclair, you mystified me with the short life flow pollutants and the long-lived stock pollutants and so forth. But the one message I did get clearly from you is that you reckon we're not good enough to survive. Well, I can't understand why you're not on a beach with a pina colada in your hand rather than up here working, if you really believe that. If you think we're actually ruined, well, I reckon you should be doing something different. As far as getting rich goes, which seemed to be your other big point, yes, of course we'll get rich by manufacturing and deploying renewable energy technology in this country. That's what all of the other leading countries in the area are doing. There was a few points from the audience that I'd like to address if I have time. If not a market, then what should we use? If anyone's got any suggestions, I'd love to hear. But one thing that does worry me about this debate is it's going to become like the Republican debate. If we let the perfect become the enemy of the good, there'll be various options up there and we'll never agree on them and we'll end up just where we are now.
Sinclair, before you head off for your pina colada, 2 minutes.
Yes, I was promised red wine, actually. Well, I just want to say, Tim, that the environment is actually quite important, and given that, I think it's actually even more important that we get things right. Now, what's quite important is that I think a lot of the speakers on your table forgot, is that there's a huge difference between an argument on the science and an argument on the policy. We can accept the science to be completely and absolutely incontrovertible, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the policy is incontrovertible. And unfortunately, that's the mistake Adam has made. He said, well, the science is telling us that we're in trouble, and indeed it is, so therefore we must have a tax. And I think the problem really is the and therefore. We don't necessarily need to have a tax, as we've indicated here on this side. Feed-in tariffs work very, very well. Feed-in tariffs are not a tax. So if they are succeeding and they are not a tax, I think our case is actually made. Now, the argument is that do we have a tax or the tax? Well, any tax can work in theory. The argument that we've made here is that these taxes will not actually work in practice. We need to think what works in practice because the environment is important. We need to get it right. The argument about, well, you're just buying insurance is actually very misleading. We don't buy any insurance. We look around for a product that suits our needs. When you see an insurance advert, it always says, read the disclosure statement. Well, we don't have a disclosure statement, we just simply have a tax, and if you don't buy the tax, you're some sort of evil denialist. Well, I don't accept that to be true. Giving money to the government doesn't guarantee success. We know that. This is what this tax wants, just to take money, any money from the public, and that's all fine. On the argument of the insurance principles, bear in mind, buying insurance deals with risk. Climate change is not risk. Climate change is uncertainty. We know there is a problem. We know that something is going to happen, but we can't be sure when and how it's going to be happening. We need to empower future generations to solve the problem better than we can imagine the problem will be. Thank you.
And finally, Adam Bandt.
But what we do know, Sinclair, is that if we act now, we can minimise the cost to us and to the future. We know that there are 67,000 jobs dependent on the Great Barrier Reef and tourism associated with it, and that dwarfs the number of people who are directly employed in mining. And we do know that if we decided to cut and get to a zero-emissions economy by the middle of the century, we will avoid the predictions of Lord Nicholas Stern that our future generations at the 2100 mark are going to have to spend between 10 and 20% of their GDP just dealing with the mitigation alone, which was essentially your whole argument. Basically, the barriers to acting on climate change are not technical, they're political. We need all shoulders to the wheel. I would love to see a feed-in tariff. It's worked in Germany, it's worked elsewhere, but it involves adding an extra several cents per kilowatt hour to your bill. And in an environment where we are one overweight Labor backbencher away from Tony Abbott becoming Prime Minister, is the government actually going to have the courage to do that? And I can tell you that we raised it with them, and the response that you get from the likes of Sinclair and that you get from the likes of others to a feed-in tariff is, well, effectively you're just asking poor people to subsidise rich people putting solar panels on their roofs. So let's not pretend that there's some high and mighty principle over here in defence of feed-in tariffs. I think it would be a great idea, but we're not going to get it over the line. Gas, I agree with Matt. I've been pilloried on the front page of The Australian for warning that gas producers are effectively going to end up with stranded assets in 20 times. Being pilloried on the front page of The Australian tells me I'm doing something right, so I am happy about that. But in the political environment that we're in now, we have to take a start. If we don't put a price on pollution, we are going to be a drag on the rest of the world acting, because every developing country can legitimately look to us and say, well, you're not doing it, so why should we? And if we don't get started, we won't get started in transforming our economy. If we don't do it now, we won't get started in ever making polluters pay for the real cost of their pollution. So I want to get to 100% renewable energy as soon as possible. I want us to have a snowy hydro for the 21st century. But that journey starts with the first step, and we have to start down that road, and I am really excited that the first step is a package that includes billions for renewable energy, but also putting a price on pollution.
Thank you. Before I can give you the result, which has to be tallied, let me just pass a few words of thanks to people. To our partners in putting on the debates in Melbourne, the Wheeler Centre, to Ned Barracut, who's a current affairs producer at the Wheeler Centre, the staff and management of the Melbourne Town Hall, the volunteers, as you know, who've taken all the ballots and done the count just now, the editor and management of The Age, the mayor, aldermen and officers of the City of Melbourne, the Managing Director of Staff of the ABC and our supporters, AMP. But I'd also like tonight especially to mention one person. A big thank you to Chrissy Sharp, who is the inaugural director of the Wheeler Centre, and this is her last Intelligence Squared debate because she finishes in that role tomorrow and is departing both from the partnership and also from our shores, where she will be replaced by the new director at the Wheeler Centre, Michael Williams. But would you join with me in particularly thanking Chrissy? She was the one with the vision that this series would be something which would really fire within Melbourne. Before I give you the results, let us also, though, pay particular thanks to our speakers tonight, Stuart Allinson, Matthew Wright, Professor Sinclair Davidson, Fiona O'Hehir, Tim Flannery and Adam Bandt. Please. Right, well, as you know, there's a pre-debate poll, and the results of that were that before the debate began, there was 20% of the people here were undecided on the topic, 23% were for the proposition, and 57% were against. After the debate, the don't knows have reduced to 7%, for 25%, but by a significant margin, the debate is declared for the side that it was against the proposition with a margin of 68%. I declare that motion lost. With that declaration, I'd like to thank all members of this House for your support and participation in the debate, which I now declare to be closed.